Thank you for the ongoing FOLCS series here at the FOLCS film series at the 92nd Street Y. Ed Zwick, before I even introduce you, I want to say that, and I don't know if you know this, we've hosted Oliver Stone here. We talked about Wall Street. We had Robert Benton. We did Kramer versus Kramer. You get the themes, right? We had Barry Levinson for Sleepers. We even had Peter Bogdanovich for a film he didn't direct, but he loved so much, Anatomy of a Murder. And we've had many other directors, but I have always wanted to do The Siege, and I've always wanted to host you, so I'm so thrilled we're being able to do this. I must say that I didn't see The Siege when it first came out, and when I saw it after 9/11, and I'm a big Ed Zwick fan, I'm going to say this in a second, my mouth still is dropped from this prescience foreshadowing of what we ultimately experienced. So that's really what a large part of tonight is about. But I must tell you, I was a Wall Street lawyer in the mid-1980s, and I worked so hard that I indulged with one guilty pleasure, was 30-something. It was a friend of mine, he might be here, but we would literally, the next morning, we would discuss it as if it was a Talmud class. This is when, then we went back and did really boring work and waited for the next, was it Tuesday night? I can't remember what night it was, and Wednesday it was Talmud class again with Ed Zwick and Marshall Hershkovitz. We went to see Glory because we knew that you directed it. That was what, your first of your 3 Denzel Washington films. I was a big fan of the novella of Jim Harrison's, what is the? Legends of the Fall. Legends of the Fall is the only, I can tell you, if you saw this movie, it's astonishing. It's the only movie adaptation I can say is that the movie is way better than the novella. It's actually very different from it. You did some different things. And for those of you who don't know, in addition to his directorial work, he actually co-wrote the screenplay for The Siege. He's produced films including Shakespeare in Love and I Am Sam, which were Oscar-winning films. And you now have yet another TV show, Once and Again, which has won awards. And I will tell you another reason to clap for Ed. We hopefully will have you back here in the fall. You have a new movie coming out. We know you're very proud of it. It's based on a New Yorker story, Trial by Fire. It's about an execution that took place in Texas, and it may be the execution of an innocent man. And that film will be out in the fall, and maybe we'll bring Ed back if he'd be willing to be part of this again. So, ladies and gentlemen, Ed Zwick. And sitting next to him is the lovely Juliette Kayyem. Now, let me just tell you something that you may not know. She's already taken a patent out on the words Homeland and Security. She owns the words. They're her words, and they really are her words. You see her all the time on CNN as their national security and terrorism analyst. She worked in the Obama administration as an assistant secretary of Homeland Security. Yep. There she goes again. She teaches now and directs the faculty program of the Kennedy School, Harvard Homeland Security branch. Yeah. And yet again, Homeland Security, and you run that at the Kennedy School. You were the governor of Massachusetts, Counterterrorism and Homeland Security advisor. Mm-hmm. I wasn't kidding in every way. So you even have a memoir out about being a mother and an expert on security. Terrorism, yeah. I will also tell you all that for this reason, I generally don't leave my house without Juliette telling me it's okay. I'm not stupid, I know. And I actually know that the bombing of Syria...
Oh, you're going to tell them, are you, what I said?
...is not going to happen now because she's with us.
Oh, yeah, no.
Because I cleared it...
If it doesn't happen by 11 p.m., it's not happening tonight because of the time difference.
I think it's because President Trump knows you're here, and it would be pointless to do this without you. And I should tell you, she would not be embarrassed to know this, that you should know this. I met her when she was running for governor of Massachusetts, and I supported her then, and I hope that she will return to public life, and I hope that I hope that you've been introduced to her in such a sweet way that you too will support her, Juliette Kayyem.
Thank you.
And David, it's Scharia, right?
Yeah.
It's not Sharia law, it's Scharia. That would be a really bad slip of the tongue. David is also a friend. He is internationally recognized expert on counterterrorism and security. He has this incredible job. He is the chief of counterterrorism branch. It's like a task force, I guess, for the United Nations Security Council. David is the one who advises them and alerts them to everything they need to know about national security and counterterrorism. And he has an entire staff that does that, and we'll talk a little about that. He's a widely recognized author as well, and David Scharia. So let me start off, before we start the conversation, I'm going to show two clips side by side. There's essentially 5 terrorism scenes in this film. The film is made in 1998. It was released. I don't know when it was shot, I guess the year before. You walked into 20th Century Fox and you said to them, all right, here's the pitch. We're going to blow up a theater on Broadway. We're going to blow up a bus in Williamsburg. We're going to take a school hostage in Brooklyn, and we're going to impose martial law on Brooklyn, and we're going to blow up the FBI building. I mean, they must have thought you were insane. They must have said, no one will believe this. What did they say?
Those of us who were making the movie, I'll evoke someone named Larry Wright, who was collaborating with me, who then later wrote The Looming Tower, and many to whom I had spoken believed that what we were writing was in fact just speculative history rather than fiction. And I think to a film studio, they looked upon it just as fiction.
Yeah.
And
did you tell them that we actually see this as a story that we will all live through?
You know, I think, frankly, that's not the level on which they run their business. It was important to us.
I see.
And there were a number of people who, first of all, I mean, just to contextualize this just for a moment, you have to remember that in 1993,
right,
5 years before this, people had tried to blow up the World Trade Center and had tried to blow up the Hudson Tunnel, but for a quirk of, logistics might have. So there was that. And there was also the historical circumstance of what was happening in so many other places. And I also, because my background is first as a journalist, there are a number of people that I was able to speak to and partake of, some of whom you people might know. I was a classmate of Merrick Garland, who was a very good friend of mine and who had worked for Janet Reno and had been involved in Waco. And there were any number of others whom I knew in France and in England and in Israel whose concerns with these issues was immediate. And even as we began to do the research with the FBI NYPD Counterterrorism Task Force, they were looking upon this as not an if, but a when. Yeah. So what is perceived by some to be prescient was in fact just a kind of close listening.
Yeah. But it said there's so many things in it. We're actually watching clips, so for those of you who saw it more recently, I was thrown by it again when I realized that at one point Denzel Washington actually invokes the words, live in paradise with 70 virgins, right? Before anyone talked about, why does one become a martyr, this movie actually invokes the phrase 70 virgins.
Well, there's several books. Obviously, we read voluminously before you do something like this, but there was one book called, I think it was God Has 1,000 Names. Do you know that
Judith
book?
Miller, yeah.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary book
No,
that
is that Judith? No, it's Robin. I think it might be Robin Wright. I'm forgetting.
Well, in any case, what it does, it actually categorically goes from country to country and issue to issue in terms of Islamist terrorism and tries to anticipate or even to talk what's the circumstance on the ground and what might come. So, again, it was more about actually doing the due diligence than it is about, and then extrapolating outward. But to place it here and to imagine something that is asymmetrical and something that is different was in fact only different to hear.
Right. But again, there's no ISIS, obviously. Al-Qaeda is not even mentioned. Right. Islamic Jihad is, and Hamas is mentioned. we actually are sitting next to, in this case, a woman who was formerly the Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security. 1998,
Yeah.
This is primitive investigative techniques? Is this some of this we would see today?
Yeah, you would. I mean, let me, before I answer that, I just want to say something about, that was so illuminating what Ed said about, how realistic was this movie. So at the same time, Ed's thinking of the movie and pitching the movie. So I get appointed to the National Commission on Terrorism in 1998. So what is that? Well, 1999, sorry. So that was after the Africa embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, led by bin Laden. Like any good response in America, they create a congressional commission because no one wants to deal with the problem and so it was about 10 of us, a whole bunch of counterterrorism and military people. I had been serving at the Department of Justice at the time and got pulled to serve on to be a commissioner on the commission. And we released a report in '99 that essentially was that report that said we're vulnerable to bin Laden. He's not going away. Al-Qaeda's coming. One of the reports that was, of course, ignored. And had the same thought that if you would just listen, there were enough people out there sort of saying, the Cold War's over, we won, yay, but there's a different kind of threat, and it's taking advantage of our vulnerabilities. In terms of these scenes,
can I just I just want to jump in because now that you and Ed said something this is just incredibly disturbing because there was a presumption after 9/11 that really we just missed it. The CIA missed it. No one was really watching this, and they missed it, and now they were ramping up to figure it out. And both of you were actually saying, that is not true. Everyone had actually figured it out, and they just knew it was a question of when.
Right. It was a question of when and how, and look, there were attempts to get bin Laden before 2001. He had a steady drumbeat, sort of.
But no one really knew his name.
Right.
At 9/11, I remember watching CNN, and his name was mispronounced 15 times.
Yeah.
Like it's as if we, for the first time, heard of this person.
No, I mean I was on a train to New York the morning of 9/11 with my newborn, and describe it in my book, and sort of, I'm fielding phone calls because I was serving on the National Commission on Terrorism. There's like 10 of us, right? That no one, what's this thing? And the questions that we're getting were sort of, what's the Taliban? Who's this bin Laden person? But there was an apparatus that was looking at it. I mean, part of it was, that there are multiple dangers out in America and against the homeland, and this was just one. And the spectacularness, I don't mean as a compliment, of 9/11 really was difficult to imagine given the low-grade stuff that bin Laden had done before, which was essentially just car bombs. I don't mean to sound not sympathetic to it, but car bombs have been around for a long time. Like people have been using.
So but if Ed had gone to 20th Century Fox and said, we're going to blow up the World Trade Center, that might have caught their attention in a different way, saying, oh, please. Right? I mean, what you're saying is how spectacular.
Well, remember they had tried, someone had tried, but that's exactly right. So, so remember in these scenes, and I just recently resaw the movie and it just holds up, but how little has changed. There's like two quick things. I mean, one is obviously this, the sophistication of the terrorists, or the lack of sophistication of the government, remember, is equal parts to what the terrorists had. So if that seemed, so old school in 1990s or whatever, I mean, the terrorists have the same limitations. And the goal now is that, you have encryption and all sorts of ways to try to figure out what's going on, or anti-encryption devices to figure out what's going on with bad actors. I think the second issue, and we were only getting hints of it right now, but is the extent to which the immigration, Arab and Muslim aspects of this are starting to come to play. The movie gets much more stressful in this regard.
And hence the beginning of thinking about visa applications.
Student visa applications,
clearly
visas, bans, all that stuff. How did he get in? And the student visa often seen as a loophole rather than an opportunity, and sort of how you look at it. And in the context of the politics today, you mean
like the Muslim ban?
Like a Muslim ban, you can think, I have strong feelings about it, but you can think about, the consequences of designing a nation around sort of bans and walls, right? So is the numbers that we're starting to see on tourism and student, international students, which is, down 10, 15%. I think New York City's getting hit for the first time in terms of tourism down. These have larger consequences than just, a wall or a ban. You're starting to see it. And so I like that little point about retail sales are down 60%. These do have economic consequences both ways.
So here's something maybe you and David can answer for us. Such a large subtext to this film, and you, by the way, your friend Lawrence Wright, who co-wrote this and of course wrote The Looming Tower, now that's on Hulu, you can actually watch it. You're seeing the same thing played out, this conflict, the tension between the FBI and the CIA. Ed's film goes even further. There's like so many stakeholders in Ed's film. There's a congressional committee that's in there, right? The military, all of a sudden, is a stakeholder for other reasons that we'll discuss. The president, oddly, and his national security advisor is a stakeholder. We don't normally see it, but Ed threw all of them in there. So the question I would ask for you, and maybe David can jump in as well, is who's really in charge? I mean, it's very, because this is the same scene that I'm watching now in Hulu's The Looming Tower with the terrorism, the O'Connell and the guy from the CIA who, they do not cooperate, they don't like each other, they sabotage each other, they're suspicious of each other, they're not cooperating at all. Everyone has a different agenda, and things are blowing up.
I'm
The
left
guy
with
from
this
the
question.
UN.
You immediately throw it to me.
I can feel.
I want to first, if you don't mind, relate to the point that Juliette made about how terrorist investigations have changed since then. And in many ways, they remain the same. I mean, there's one scene here when cash is being brought into the scene.
Yeah.
This is still the way that ISIL today moves money. Not the only way, but still a main way that money moves, and hence terrorist investigations.
But the same way, that like literally carrying a bag into
literally,
a store.
Yeah.
Right.
But there are two different developments that are new, and if the movie had been done today, they would probably have to look at them. And the first one is the way terrorists use technology. In the film, they are very, very low tech. And back then, they were low tech. Today, what we're seeing is a phenomenon of terrorists being able to take everything from the recruitment process, to the training, to the financing, to the perpetration of the attack through technology. And that is a whole new dimension that requires investigative tools that back then were not even needed. Second point, which is also it's quite innovative in the film, when Annette Bening tells Denzel Washington, listen, they operate separately. Yeah. Each cell doesn't know what the other does, which, yes, was the situation back then and was a novelty. Today, we're seeing a whole new level where individuals acting alone. Mm-hmm. They don't need even the cell to act. They don't need to get instructions. They don't need to be coordinated. They get everything they need, including how to prepare a bomb in your mother's kitchen. And I'm not joking, just Google it, and the FBI will be immediately after you, because there is a manual online that you could easily download how to prepare a bomb in your mom's kitchen. And that's not hypothetical, because if you take, for example, the Boston Marathon attack,
what they did.
This is exactly what happened. So that is a whole new dimension, and investigations need to take that dimension into action. And I should have said when I've started that I'm in my personal capacity. I'm official of the UN, but I would say now I'm not speaking on behalf of the UN.
I know this about you. I was afraid some of the times he would turn to the audience and say, I can't answer that.
Yeah. No, but I mean, so going back to the question you asked, who is in charge? Not just in the US, but in almost all countries, there is no one person in charge except for the prime minister or the president. In most cases, the counterterrorism work is being dispersed between several agencies that sometimes work very well together, sometimes they don't work together. I remember around that time, actually, no, a few years later, I was chairing a counterterrorism committee that was established, interministerial committee in Israel that was established to make sure that the Shin Bet and the Ministry of Justice and the Attorney General and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs are working back together. And everyone in the room thought that they're in charge. Even me.
but that's
I was
Israel.
chairing, and I thought that I'm in charge, only to learn that others telling me, sorry,
You are
you're
not.
chairing, but we are in charge. So nothing has changed much, except for the fact that I think in general, globally, we're seeing much more cooperation, much more coordination, and much more mechanism, including fusion centers, not just in the US, but in other countries, that meant to bring different agencies together so that they actually work.
That's-
So I was going to say, you know, when you were Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security, did you have to get on the phone and start screaming at the FBI at some point? I mean, what actually, you would think that someone, what David is saying, that can't be right? I mean, it's right, but someone has to step in and say, how could you have not shared this information with me?
Right, so, and I just wanted, before I answer that, just to pick up on this idea of, you know, sort of this intelligence and this intelligence sharing. The challenge right now in counterterrorism is there's absolutely no intelligence to share, and that's just the nature of the kind of threat that we're facing. So no security apparatus, and this is not fatalistic, no security apparatus will be able to find every guy with mental issues or whatever issues he has who finds, you know, goes online, the guy is buying hate, ISIS is selling it, so it's a perfect transaction. He finds, let's say in the United States, finds an easy weapon, because that's the problem here, or rents a car, and finds one of a million soft targets, and no security apparatus will 100% stop that kind of threat. So in terms of intelligence, while there is a need for a super squirrely world, and especially in the international context a lot of times, that is why people like me, you know, talk a lot about community engagement and see something, say something, and actually because in every single instance, the wife, the girlfriend, the mother, the whatever, and in some instances you actually see them coming forward and the FBI is not paying enough attention. So that's the challenge now, is that not only is it in networks that are really hard to detect, and some of them are encrypted and they might be more sophisticated, sometimes it's just, there's like nothing to detect, right?
But that's also because of what David said, there aren't any cells anymore.
No,
There's
it's
just
it's
one
just
guy
a
and an iPhone.
Right, it's just a radicalization process that is really hard to explain, and with the, you know, with access to weaponry or access to something as seemingly benign as a car becomes a weapon of mass destruction.
And it becomes a much more holistic conversation having to do with the society.
Exactly.
Because when you see the young British kids who were in fact socialized within the social system program in England, who nonetheless become the subway bombers, you inevitably come all the way back full circle to the conversation about immigration and about things like economic opportunity, socialization, community, all those things which in fact are the hallmark of a society that is not a society of walls and borders.
No, that's when people ask me, you know, what makes the United States relatively safe? Relatively, I mean, I have to put aside guns, but let me just say in terms of the kind of threat that your movie focused on, obviously our oceans help. So you cannot drive from Boston to Damascus. You said the radicalization process or the training process cannot be easy. But the other is, and you know, we're not perfect, but through our history, we have been able to turn the other into us. So, you know, I grew up in LA, so, you know, the Mexican community, or Dearborn in Michigan, or the Irish in Massachusetts, so that idea of integration, rather more than assimilation, but integration, that these communities actually view America's safety and security as their own, has been a wild success here. And anything one would do, like, for example, a ban that might radicalize communities here, that would undermine that, would actually make us less safe overall. And that's not just fanciful thinking, or I want to be liberal. That's like literally, you look at America's success in that regard. We don't have 3,000 American men, as, you know, whatever, name your country, or 5,000 Frenchmen, or whatever it is, you know, traveling, trying to get, join ISIS and get trained and come back and destroy this country. But we have cases, no question about that, but we don't have epidemics.
But we don't have no-go zones either.
Right.
I mean, we have a number of things that we're...
Yeah, the geography,
The geography itself, that
Yeah.
like in France, you can see how this would happen with no-go zones where they have like almost their own small
Right.
little community that is completely separated and unassimilated. And then, of course, as Ed would say, and unemployed, all of the social,
Yeah.
the pathologies that feed into this. David, you...
I think this is one of the most impressive things in the movie. And for me, to see that in 1998, where the conversation about all this issue of society and resilience and integration was not taking place anywhere. Terrorism was back then perceived as something which is very connected to conflict, proxy war, extension of conflict. And Ed managed to capture elements of how society reacts to terrorism, how society accepts or not accepts government's response, and the strength of society in ways that only now we have research that could corroborate what Juliette just said, and on how this fits with terrorism. And one thing that I would say, and this movie captures very well, is the resilience of New York City. And to capture that in '98 is amazing.
Yeah.
Because take a few months from ago, there was a terrorist attack in New York City by a person, individual, acting on his own and killing a few people. And if you recall, that was on the day of Halloween. And I was very interested to see how people will react. And you know, the streets were full. Everybody went to celebrate Halloween as if nothing happened. Nobody in New York City have considered that because of that we should stay home. Parents let kids go. And that is the beauty of the resilience of this city, which I think the movie amazingly captures 20 years ago.
You know, what I was even thinking at the moment is the fact that in between the years of 1900 and 1920, there were 630 anarchist bombings in America. And that's literally forgotten. I think I have to evoke that, and people say, what are you talking about? There was, a bomb on Wall Street that killed 40 people.
Well, this is all Sacco and Vanzetti, this whole,
That
this
whole time.
era.
And
that
so
whole-
this isn't new even to New York City.
Yeah. I'm going to show another clip, but I wanted to add to what you, both David, all three of you just said about this sort of the psychodynamics of people that isn't even ideological. We may not see the last scene that I wanted to show because there's so much to talk about. There's this wonderful moment where the terrorist at the end, the final guy, literally he puts the gun to Benning's head and he says, "You left me in Iran like a piece of shit." Right? As if to say, this is about you and me having sex, and you left me there, right? He doesn't invoke the teachings of Anwar al-Awlaki. He's not talking about bin Laden. He said, we're having sex, and then you left me in Iran. And that sense of this is also underneath this, and it's not all theocracy. All right, let's take a look at this scene, and this will be self-explanatory because it really speaks to something that we have been agonizing about, and Juliette has been involved in. We've all been talking about how far you can go to investigate and prosecute under the constitution of our laws. Do we engage in civilian trials? Do we have military commissions? There's some earlier scenes. At one point, Tony Shalhoub, the character, punches the person that they picked up. And Denzel Washington, as FBI person, says, "If I see you do this again, you're fired," right? Just punching in the back of the car, right? There's another scene in which Annette Bening is saying, "Forget judges and warrants. Let's go get them now. We got to move. If we don't get it now, they're going to be on a flight to Saudi Arabia in an hour," right? Which is exactly what people say all the time after 9/11. If we provide the full panoply of constitutional protections, everyone's flying back to Saudi Arabia in an hour. So this film picks up on that because he says to her in that scene, he says, "Hey, you're an American. Like, don't you know what it means to be an American?" So Ed, I want to start with you, and then we're obviously all going to talk about this, but I want to talk about, this is 1998. You may have thought about the premonitions of this, but if 9/11 had happened, and the Boston Marathon bombing had also happened, would you have still given this film the point of view? Because there is a point of view here. Civil liberties are more important than national security. In the balancing, we don't want to lose our constitutional soul. But maybe in 1998, since none of us could pronounce Osama bin Laden, it's convenient to make this argument, but that after the two big attacks in the United States, I think you get a lot of Americans that would say, waterboard him.
It only would have made the movie better. You know, I mean, to have...
Because you would have made it the same.
Well, because so as to have that kind of dialectic is what makes for good drama. And I think that argument is a even more legitimate argument now than it was before. Just parenthetically, the idea that an FBI man is the hero of this movie
It's like now.
is rather the most prescient thing that I couldn't have imagined. Because having
Every liberal in the room is like, go FBI.
I mean, having been raised, in the 1960s and
J. Edgar
studying
Hoover.
COINTELPRO and all of this, that was in fact the most presumptuous thing I could have done. But I just think that this kind of extreme position was the whole point of the movie, because it gives you an opportunity to be rhetorical and to take issues that seem theoretical and try to put them in terms of real people, a friendship, a relationship between two peers, and then extend outward to a whole community. And I think that was the intention. And I think, in answer to your question, it would have made it an even more provocative movie.
Juliette, I'm so unsatisfied with that answer. I need you, as a person who owns the words homeland and security, to talk about this, because I will tell you, you're going to love this anecdote. Oh, we had Sidney Lumet here once. By the way, we showed a film that no one saw. It was so radioactive that HBO only showed it once, because it came out after 9/11, and it had a kind of anti-counterterrorist, civil liberties. It had the thing that happened with Bill Maher. You start, don't say the wrong thing. And this was a movie that was written by Tom Fontana. It was called Strip Search, and it was really about the denial of civil liberties in the aftermath of 9/11. But I have a tape. You can go on our website and see. Sidney Lumet, old school lefty. I said to him, well, let's ask you the moral and legal question. If you could torture someone, you'd save 3,000 lives, would you torture him? This is an old school lefty in his 80s, and you could see he was visibly uncomfortable. We asked the tough questions. And he said, you could see him, he goes, I'd have to darn well know that they know that they could stop the bomb by torturing. And it was as if he was acknowledging, I too would accept the fact that I'm willing. You heard, what is the Bruce Willis line? One man will have to, what is it? Suffer the consequences for all, or something. That is a perspective that's an important one.
So the question is, would you want to set up a homeland or apparatus built around which default do you want to build your system around? That there is the ticking time bomb scenario, which is BS, or
you're saying that's never true.
And if it were, then think about, okay, I have that one situation in 10,000. In 10 billion, right? Where I have the guy, he knows how to save 300 lives, and if I torture him, lots of assumptions in that, he'll tell me the truth. Lots of assumptions, most torture results in not verifiable or valid information. So I would much rather have a system that said, okay, if you find me that situation, then, the president has to approve it, or some situation in which you're not actually making the decision where we're allowed to do this because your judgment is that you're going to get the information. So that's how I would want to set up a legal system, and this is how we set up the assassination ban. We all think we have an assassination ban. We absolutely do. We do not allow the CIA to assassinate political leaders. There are well-known exceptions to that, but they require presidential approval, because you want to put it on the political guy to say, yeah, this is the situation. So I want my default to be, that's going to be the exception with the ratchet up. And I want my normal steady state to be, you know, exactly what Denzel Washington was saying, which is in extraordinary times, like, you know, let me just say, the law is rarely a bar to getting the bad guys. The law can move, the law is more rational than, you know, the Fourth Amendment. Those things are more rational. You can arrest, you can do lots of things. Generally, the law is used as an excuse for two reasons. One is just incompetence, right? So you just didn't do the right thing. And the other is because people have a political agenda, as you see brilliantly in the movie, to bring in a heavier authoritarian power, which is in this case the military.
David, I know you want to answer it, but I want to also ask from a UN's perspective whether there is a perspective there. You advise the Security Council. Not all of those countries are liberal democracies. Do they have a position that they prefer civil liberties to national security, that in all instances they would want a strict adherence to legal constitutional standards over, you know, the equivalent of what's being offered in the film with martial law, where, you know, I didn't show you that scene, but there's an incredibly creepy scene when you see the tanks coming over the Brooklyn Bridge, and you then see Bruce Willis standing on the side of the Brooklyn Bridge, making an announcement essentially to all the Arabs of Brooklyn, and says, you are going to be facing the most fierce fighting machine in the history of mankind, and we will find you. You know, we will go house to house, and we will find you. And by the way, you know, no one's going to like when I say this here, but if you look at the film, that stuff works. It's horrifying, but they kind of, you know, they put every Muslim male from the age of 15 to 34 in a lockup, and they go house to house. You know, if you want to catch the bad guys, Bruce Willis would say over-inclusiveness is better.
Well, and just to evoke one thing, you have to remember that there was a man named Tom Charles Houston during the Watergate period who had proposed to do that to student protesters into RFK Stadium. Yeah. It's not a new thought.
Right, except that none of the student protesters blew anything up, right? And so that would be, right, go ahead, David.
Yeah. In general, relating to your question, what the Security Council always recommends is balancing civil liberties and national security, but that's on a very 30,000 feet above ground level. You have to give meaning to it in every scenario that...
Why? Because you're saying it doesn't mean anything on its own.
Yes, you have to give it meaning in how does it impact investigations, how it impacts detentions, etc. Clearly, when it comes to torture, there is no balancing. Torture is absolutely prohibited. But what is very, very interesting is, and I don't know if that served as inspiration to that scene for you, that exactly on the time that this movie was released, this conversation took place before the Supreme Court of Israel, where it was about to decide. And these arguments were exactly the arguments given by the state representative versus the argument given by those NGOs.
You're saying someone literally said waterboarding works.
I'm not sure waterboarding, but other techniques. And as it says in the movie, the Israelis using it, but in '98, the Supreme Court was exactly looking into this question of those investigative techniques, and in '99 handed down a decision that banned the use of those techniques. So that was not a hypothetical conversation in '98 in Israel. And I don't know, again, Ed, if you were aware of it when you worked on the movie or not.
Happy accident.
But this is exactly what happened back then.
So are we saying now, I mean, this is, you know, we become a nerd to this. It's 17 years since 9/11. Are you saying that for 8 years of the Bush administration, we wasted our time debating this question, the difference between, I remember in this city in particular, endless discussions of whether we can have trials with one of the
Military.
Yeah, military commission. No, have it here in a civilian trial for, I'm trying to remember the name of his name, Mohammed Sheikh.
Khalid Sheikh Mohammed.
Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, MSK or whatever.
KSM.
KSM, right, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And there was an endless debates of what would we do? We would have to put military police around Foley Square because it wouldn't be safe to go downtown. And that there were people like Peter King on Capitol Hill who were saying, well, if you would apply the Constitution strictly, you're going to have mistakes and people are going to be able to go home. They'll be acquitted. And the only way you can assure it is if you reduce the constitutional protections that you get in a military commission, and you reduce the transparency. I mean, let's face it, George W. Bush had the right idea. He said, well, if you have it in Guantanamo Bay, no one will know what we're doing.
Well,
but
they do know what you're doing, and you know what's happening there.
But if you
not
have
a single military commission has come to a verdict.
Right.
Sorry.
But
So
but they also didn't release anybody. And in the end,
I mean, you're down to what, 40 detainees and Gitmo? I mean, I'm pretty hardcore about this, which I think there was the U.S. district courts, as I say, like the law is often not the enemy, have done a fabulous job in counterterrorism. I mean, absolutely fabulous. You cannot find a single example of a case that was a good case as compared to some of these bogus cases that prosecutors sometimes bring, of which a violent terrorist who would threaten yours and mine's children was actually released. These are effective cases. They're using 250 years of case law and statutory law with judges who know what they're doing and putting them away. You create, and I mean, this is a little bit where if you create an entirely different system, one, it tends to be ineffective. So this is what we're seeing in Guantanamo Bay. So not a single trial. 15, 16 years later, you think this is a successful system? Those guys would have been brought here. They'd be, somewhere in Kentucky at some, high max facility, and we'd be done, right? I mean, it would be done.
But can I just add one thing to this to, mess with your head?
Yeah.
Okay. So when we did in the Eastern District, I remember, was it Bin Laden's chauffeur?
Yeah, that's Africa, yeah.
Right, so we had Bin Laden's chauffeur. So he was prosecuted, was it him or was it someone else? It was like 50 accounts of counterterrorism. And they wound up acquitting him of 49 of the 50, and he was acquitted of something else, which seemed like such a lesser offense, and he was given lifetime in prison. So I'm just saying that it looks a little uneven and messy, because yes, we apply the civil trial, and we apply underlying criminal law, but we couldn't actually come to a verdict. I'm not saying it's because the evidence is impossible to show in a civilian trial, and in Guantanamo you can say whatever you want, but it doesn't look, I mean, it's true, we don't release anybody, but we don't actually convict them of the worst offenses.
That's just not true. I mean, there's case after case in which people are actually being convicted, if they survive, of terrorism counts. And then you would just have to prove to people that the alternative was working. And I think 16 years later, 15 years later on Guantanamo Bay, that alternative is not working. That alternative is like literally you've got a bunch of, you have these courts that are literally not working. And if you follow along, and most people have forgotten about Guantanamo Bay, you've got lawyers being put in jail because they refuse to satisfy us. There's no law. It's like this lawless land. So, so to say, oh, the alternative would be better, I actually have seen the alternative, and 15 years later, the jury's in. And
you're saying this at least produces a result that is a result.
Yeah.
Okay. Ed, the film has it does something that I've never seen before, the imposition of martial law in the United States, tanks rolling in, house-to-house arrests. After 9/11, had George W. Bush decided, remember, he would have had more leeway in the early days, right? People didn't even talk about, at the time, that's why I'm saying that Sidney Lumet's movie, no one saw it because HBO was afraid to show it. Bill Maher lost his job on Politically Incorrect because of this. And George W. Bush pushed through, if he could have, some martial law. One of the things that you see in this movie, which goes to David's resilience, is you end up seeing Jews and Arabs on the streets of Brooklyn together chanting against the martial law and against the imposition of these rules against Muslims. Do you think that this is really America?
Well, I mean, frankly, that is, by my count, the element that is the most pushed in the movie. Because the issue of posse comitatus, frankly, which I'd love to hear Juliette talk about, particularly given this moment about sending troops, to the border, is, I think, one of the most interesting historical issues of America. It has been, in fact, when you dig deep into the history of Ruby Ridge and Waco, the gray zone between the militarization of federal agencies and the use of various kinds of force and weaponry has in fact been more fluid than any of us would care to really imagine or in fact know about. Whether it would get to that point, it's one of those hypotheticals based on the circumstance that I was portraying. I don't believe, really, given what I know about law enforcement, that it would necessarily come to that moment now. But if it did, that's why I raised the
But you do
hypothetical.
You do it so dramatically, because there is, we saw the scene, the Broadway theater scene, before it ends on the image of the World Trade Center. You hear someone on talk radio say, "Why are we letting these people into this country?" You know, you start to see this kind of nativistic, tone, right? But yet the movie takes you in a very different place where everyone is on the same page against martial law, against
in New York.
In New York.
In New York City.
Yeah.
I think there are other
You think
places.
red states
I'm
might
not
have
sure it'd
worked.
be the same in Oklahoma City after that particular bombing.
Yeah.
I think it's horses for courses.
It's a movie about New York City, and it's.
I love that you keep pointing that out.
I would assume that the reaction today would have been the same.
Wow.
I don't even question that.
That people would have responded
Yes.
in solidarity.
Yes, people go to the streets here for much less than that.
Juliette, I saw you on Saturday morning because I usually don't leave the house until you say it's okay.
Okay, yeah.
And on Saturday morning, I was at the gym, and there you were again, of course, and I was deciding whether I could go out. And it just so happened there was a terrorist attack in Munster.
And yes, that's right.
in
Well, yeah, it attacked.
Okay, I know. Well, so this is what I want to get to.
Yeah.
So here's the point. Juliette was a little uncomfortable here. She was a little uncomfortable on CNN because the moderator asked you. I don't know if you remember this, because you're on every night, so I remember
No,
this.
I remember because I get a lot of crap.
Yeah, and I said, I remembered thinking, oh, I'm totally going there.
Yeah.
I said, I'm totally bringing this up. She said, well, do you think this is Islamic terrorism? And you went, well, how could one know? And you don't rush to judgment, and this is really an important part, and it's maybe not important. And my first thought is, this is what Trump supporters didn't like about the Obama administration, right? That they looked at Obama and said, what do you mean you can't say Islamic and terrorism? Why can't you just say those things? You know, maybe we'll be wrong in this case, but at least it sounds like this is Islamic terrorism. So
it's a challenge. You know, this rush to judgment. If it means, so just to remind people, because it's sort of if you weren't watching TV that morning, sort of came and went. A German rammed his car into a public space, so it had the sort of MO of an ISIS attack that we've become used to. I sort of view my job, my role is not my job, on TV is to, be the sort of take a deep breath person, because CNN doesn't need more, breaking news, sort of. And it just seemed to me that there were just a couple hints, and I've been in this a long time, so I can understand the language of law enforcement. So the original statement by the Germans, so interesting, at least translated, was they are treating this as a terrorist attack or possibly a mental illness issue. Now, why would they say that? Because they knew exactly who it was, and they knew that the guy was some crazy from the neighborhood, and so they just wanted to.
But
so
was he Muslim?
No. So when I hear that, I think, I should try to defend and also protect the, at the same time I'm saying that, I'm emailing the producing team at CNN and saying, I don't think this is it, because this is my expertise. So, and you get a lot of crap for that. I mean, you look at my Twitter feed after that. Oh, God, yes.
Really? People respond.
Plus, I'm Arab American, so it's like, it's like that nice combination of, I'm a terrorist lover and I won't call it what it is.
There's such irony to this because, I was a supporter of Juliette's gubernatorial campaign. And so given what you heard here today, to run for governor of a blue state like Massachusetts,
never.
They saw her as, well, she's pro-terrorism.
Yeah, no,
she would waterboard.
Yeah, no, I was a little bit too liberal. I mean, a little bit too less. I wasn't liberal enough for Massachusetts, but there's not a lot of good places for public safety Democrats right now. But I should move to Georgia and run. Yeah. And So that's sort of also not jumping to conclusions. And you have nice moments in the movie where like a car backs up and everyone jumps for the street and stuff. On the military issue, I used to oversee the National Guard in Massachusetts. I have a long history with the National Guard and the military, just given my disaster management role and a couple things. I mean, the one thing is, it'd be very rare. The entity most not wanting this, it would be the military itself, in particular in the U.S. And you saw it with the border thing that came up with Trump in the last few days.
Yes.
That Mattis can't even get 15,000 National Guards members deployed to the border. I think, what do they have, 250 between Texas and Arizona. These roles are not ones that the military wants. And you could imagine it could get bad, and if a president is egging it on, like this president would, you definitely would have a very, very scary situation. And this is where it's so weird to be nostalgic for Bush, but he did a remarkable thing in those early days, which is visiting the mosques, One America.
We are not at war with
right,
Islam.
and only deploying the National Guard to sort of critical infrastructures.
Because he could have gone Bruce Willis.
Yeah. I mean, we were, remember those first days. And don't forget, you had Richard Reed just 3 months later.
Yeah.
If Richard Reed had been successful.
This is the failed shoe bomber.
Yeah, this is, if
Detroit.
he had been successful just 3 months after 9/11, I always think that's a sort of pivot point. If he had been successful, I think Bush was good at sort of holding back. And if he had been successful, it would have been.
Well, what about the
different.
car in Broadway in Times Square?
That was much later. So that
was later.
That was I know when that was.
So you're saying Richard Reed was really close, right?
Well, that was 2000. That was still 2001. That was December 2001.
Right. So that you're saying that would have been the whammy, right?
I think that would have been like something's really.
Would have been way too much.
Yeah.
It would have been harder to hold this back.
Yeah.
Let me just get back to this question again about President Obama and his reluctance to invoke the words Islamist or Islam. The Wall Street Journal made a career of this for 8 years. Fort Hood, Major Hassan says Allahu Akbar, and we don't invoke the idea that this is, is Islamist in nature. Even the one that David pointed out, the one Halloween, he actually does scream Allahu Akbar.
Yeah.
And I love that you pointed out that, in fact, people went out trick-or-treating. Can you make the argument, I mean, you were in the Obama administration, that in fact, and maybe David could help here because he monitors this around the world, that it only helps recruitment if you focus on Islamists, if you focus on, it might have appeased many people for the Wall Street Journal readers or maybe people who voted for Trump, but it really doesn't help in any way to say, for the love of God, he's Muslim. Why can't we say he's an Islamic extremist? Why can't we use the word? Is there an argument to be made, as the Obama administration said so frequently, it will only help recruitment?
It will only help recruitment. That's what research suggests, and not in the U.S. context only.
Really, around the world.
That alienation is a key element in recruitment, and it's the basis from from where the conversation between the potential recruited and the recruiter begins. Mm-hmm. The fact that you are not part of this society is not for you. You either need to find yourself a new society that accepts Muslim, or you could Islam, or you could live a whole pure Islamic life. ISIL used it and managed to get 40,000 people to Syria through this specific rhetoric.
All right.
I could say two things that I think, again, captured so beautifully in the movie. If you want to avoid an aftermath of people in masses going towards this radical ideology, there are two things that cities can do. And the first one is, as we said, return to normal as quickly as possible. And I think you mentioned that in the movie when he said, well, in Tel Aviv they would have cleaned it, and it's true. I lived in Tel Aviv. I know, and we've seen many attacks during the same years. And in
You mean
few
like
hours,
the pizza bombs and
yes, in
the
a few
pizza
hours,
stores
we've seen
open,
the same
Sbarro.
buses being exploded in the center of Tel Aviv, and a few hours later, everything would have gone back to normal. But the second thing is how the leaders of the community react, whether they embrace, whether they bring everybody, whether they include, or whether they create the other that you mentioned. And once you create the other, it's very difficult to get them back in.
Every time when Annette Bening is screaming "shoot," I get tearful.
I know.
I get tearful. It's devastating. There are two lines there that are just extraordinary. The first one is he says, there will never be a last cell. And the second one is, you think money is power, belief is power. And I will say that in the 20 years since the siege, those 2 points are really true. If anything really survives the siege, this film, is those 2 sentences that you wrote, because, if you think about it, it reminded me actually of Spielberg's Munich, very similar scene where the Palestinian says to the Mossad, Mossad says, it's over, you're never gonna, and the Palestinian said, it's 1972, and he says, we will take forever to live our dream. Whatever the dream is, we can wait forever. We'll sit in a refugee camp forever, and belief is power. We now have other iterations of what we've seen here, and it does make me think in a terribly skeptical way that at least because belief is power, we can't stop this.
Well, I mean, I listened to what David's talking about, and his experience is deeper than mine. And sometimes even when I'm making movies like this, I feel a little bit like a kind of voyeur, because I'm a tourist in the world of people who take this, to heart every day. But what I look at in that regard is an existential reality. And I think that we have to accept it and understand it and address it on those terms. If you think that you're going to accomplish it through regime change or through any other kind of by force of arms, it's not going to happen. And so, yes, that is what I believe then, and I believe it now. And I think it's about managing and maintaining and normalizing something that, in fact, we've seen normalized even in this country.
But you look at the rest of the world. I mean, your own country, Israel. I know you're here not in a very different capacity, but Hamas has a charter. The Palestinians can wait. Everybody can wait. The Appomattox truce, D-Day, we don't have in this situation where you sign an armistice with Islamic terrorism. You don't.
I'm sorry.
So, I would put a different meaning to the term belief is power. I think belief is a source of power in the sense that what research tells us about this is that for people to act in aggression, they need justification. Justification to themselves. And very often the belief is what gives them the internal justification to use violence in mean ways. And this is not just true to Islamic terrorism. We've seen it you could think of 20 different contexts where ideology serves as a way to justify inner motivations. And unless we deal with the inner motivations of individuals and groups that take them to adopt beliefs that are violence, we will remain where we are.
I mean, it just makes me fear that if Samir had not been left in Iraq, I mean, when I hear that, that's what I think, that, well, maybe that's really what this is about, that it's not ideological. Maybe there's an underlying, if Muslims in Western Europe all had jobs and felt more part of Western Europe.
I want to be careful in not, self-blaming our societies, because I think in Europe or in the US, there is a lot that has been done to integrate, to accept, and it's very easy to fall into this trap and said, if only we have given them more jobs, if only. The recruitment dynamics is very, very sophisticated. It tries to capture one experience. Let's say that person had a humiliating encounter with a police officer. He could go home, and we could see that in the movie with Frank, that he had this encounter and how it impacted him. And the question is, where do we take it from there? Do we have enough mechanisms in society that will tell that person, you had this humiliating experience with law enforcement, it's not okay, but still you're committed to society? Or there are enough others who will tell him, you had this humiliating encounter because of who you are and what you represent for this policeman.
Juliette?
I mean, I think your question assumes, or what you said sort of assumes that, at least here in the United States or in America, that there is some perfect time of peace, and if only we could fix this problem, then all would be good in the world. And as Ed mentioned, but it's true for our country. I mean, that's just not true. And I think what's interesting is what's changed since Ed's movie, in particular, I think in counterterrorism, and how I've changed. I don't actually consider myself a counterterrorism expert anymore, as you said, Homeland Security, but that's because where 2001 sort of created this idea of Homeland Security and how are we going to defend America, 2005 was really a course correction in that sense, and that was not because of the war in Iraq. It was actually because of Hurricane Katrina, where people, people said, oh my God, we're so focused on stopping 19 guys from getting on 4 airplanes, we can't save an American city from drowning. And so people like me really began to shift our orientation to what we call right of boom. So left of boom is prevention and protection, right, then the boom happens, and right of boom is response and recovery, and then ultimately resiliency, and that we might be able to judge our nation as well on how well we perform on right of boom. So not just are we at the 20th anniversary of the siege, on Monday is the 5th anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombings, and my town, I oversaw the Boston Marathon security, and while it's a tragedy to think 3 people died at the finish line, what people should remember is that 290 people very, very injured, very, very harmed, people who might have otherwise died, but for an apparatus.
50 people lost their legs.
Well, yeah, and then plus some, or 1 or 2. Yeah. Not a single person who survived the immediate bombing died. I mean, in other words, the 290 are taken to area hospitals. You can't call that a success, but in my world, we call that a success. It means that a country that is prepared and responds and is actually more resilient. Because the difference for a city like mine of 3 dead, a tragedy certainly, and a horror, and 300 is a significant difference. So so it's a way to think about how do we judge success. Yes, we want to stop all bad things from happening, but guess what? Yeah, good luck, and it's may not be the 19 guys, it may be the hurricane or the oil spill or whatever else.
And you can't eradicate the discontent that lives inside all of us, right, but somehow is inflamed in one person or a small group of people. And that is a reality. And we find people drawn to any number of other things disproportionately to do harm to themselves or to do harm to other people because they are damaged, and we have a society that does not necessarily treat those who are damaged well, in fact less and less well, and that pertains to those who have a grievance that is a grievance of race or a grievance of religion or just an irrational one.
All right, this is one question from our audience. It's addressed to Mr. Zwick. And then we'll say goodnight to our friends. How did you come to anticipate the cell structure as well as the motives for the attack? That it does seem, this is sort of the point that I think David keeps coming back to, that it really does capture some of these things that are the nuances within this that we hadn't seen before.
I said this in the green room to someone, but you can never underestimate the willingness to be indiscreet on the part of people who should know better than to talk to a filmmaker when the filmmaker brings a movie star into the room. And I spoke to members of the CIA, I spoke to members of the FBI, I spoke to members of the Justice Department, and I was astonished at what they were willing to say to me. And even at the time, when we were doing our research, the task force was already infiltrating cells in mosques in New York City, and this was something that was just a part of the tradecraft that they were coming to understand as to how it works. And I'm sure that I had probably at that point, read all the Le Carré books as well, and any number of other people who'd written about this world, and it's all there.
This was such a great folk series. Let me just tell you that, just give you a sense of what this reminded me of. Years ago, some of you may have attended, we did one with Zero Dark 30. And we didn't have the cast, but we had Commissioner Ray Kelly, the police commissioner, and former Attorney General Mike Mukasey.
Yeah.
And one can imagine a very different conversation.
Oh, yeah.
Very different conversation. At one point, Attorney General Mukasey, who had been a federal judge, said, your head would have exploded, Juliette. He said something like, this whole nonsense about waterboarding, do you know how many people we're talking about? Just one.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that was the perspective. And that film was criticized by some people to say that they thought it had a pro-torture perspective because it gives you the impression that they found the courier through waterboarding and dates. It does seem the combination of those two. So this was just such an incredibly wonderful evening. We want to thank you for all joining us. And we have the great Ed Zwick, lovely Juliette Kayyem, David Scharia. Thank you so much. We'll see you again at the FOLCS film series at the 92nd Street Y and other events here. Thank you.